Hey everyone, welcome back to Policy Punchline. Here at the show, we interview scholars, policymakers, and business executives about some of the most urgent issues and frontier ideas in our world today. I'm Princeton Junior Tiger Gao. Today we continue our COVID-19 coverage, and as many of our listeners may know, COVID-19 has caused unprecedented disruption in the workspace. Millions of people have to work from home, and there have been so many reports springing up talking about the end of work as we know it. And personally, I've always been kind of skeptical about those futuristic claims that somehow portray this utopian image and filled with tech innovations, and we abandon our old past. But those plans often do not seek to actually present any concrete path on how we actually get there. But hopefully today, some of my skepticism can be answered by a very thoughtful, insightful industry leader, both in economics and also in business and in artificial intelligence research. His name is Dr. Martin Fleming. He is the chief economist of IBM Corporation. It's a huge tech behemoth, as you guys may know it, and his work is really fascinating and interesting. So thanks so much for joining me remotely, Dr. Fleming.
Pleased to be with you.
And co-hosting this show with me is my friend, Will Carpenter. He is a rising senior in the economics department at Princeton, just like me. We've struggled through many of the econometrics classes and grinded many late nights in libraries together. He's a brilliant guy. So thanks so much for being here with me, Will.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Tiger. Nice to be here.
So Dr. Fleming, why don't we jump right in? Would you mind just telling us a little bit more about yourself, both your education background and also your research interest in economics, and also what you influenced you to join IBM?
Sure. So I studied economics at Tufts University, earned a PhD many years ago, wrote a dissertation topic on the use of selectivity bias, the work that some of you may have studied with James Heckman from Michigan as it applies to labor markets and employment and training of workers. Spent a number of years with Reed Elsevier, which is an information services firm. They had a large economics department at the time, but fairly quickly, within a few years, moved into a strategy role and subsequently have really worked at the intersection of economics, strategy, and technology. Spent a few years with a consulting firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Had a number of technology clients, Motorola, AT&T, Philips Electronics, and IBM. I got to know the IBM folks, and they invited me to join. That was 20 years ago. And then for the past 10 years, I have been in the chief economist role. And for most of that period, also had a role as chief analytics officer. And in technology, in the technology industry in the US, it's been quite common to bring together economics and analytics. So you look at folks at, for example, Amazon. Pat Byrie at Amazon has actually hired and has more economists working than does the Federal Reserve Board in Washington. Hal Varian at Google, the folks at Zillow, Netflix, the whole range of technology firms in the US really are bringing together the skills of economists and data scientists in the analytics space, and we've done much the same. So that brings us to today.
Would you mind telling us a little bit more about your research in the intersection of AI, economics, and also IBM's current research focus and research priorities? Because for many of our listeners, it might be kind of a shocking fact to hear that Amazon hires more economists than Federal Reserve.
Sure. So in Amazon's case, of course, they want to make sure that they are getting your purchases to you in the most timely and efficient way. So being able to work out the complexity of networks and network structure and optimizing those networks. You see the very large trucks on the highway, and of course they never want to have an empty truck traveling around. So being able to do that efficiently and effectively is a challenge. And now, of course, they have the localized delivery as well, and that adds another layer of complexity. So this is network optimization is a place where economics and data science have come together over the years. And those are the kind of problems that we're all focused on. How to be able to deliver greater value to consumers and customers, while at the same time create efficiency and effectiveness for the organization who's delivering that capability. So for both sides to be able to benefit. I've spent a great deal of time looking at the impact of technology, particularly machine learning and artificial intelligence on labor markets, and to understand what that means for work in the future. And we can certainly talk about that in a lot of detail if you'd like.
That sounds great, Dr. Fleming. One quick question I had when you're mentioning doing a lot of early consulting before you also joined IBM. Like what kind of, can you just go into more specifics about what kind of businesses you're focusing on advertising, maybe some of these artificial intelligence developments? And are there any businesses that might be hesitant to take on this kind of role or this kind of change, and why?
Well, of course, when I was doing consulting, that was now more than 20 years ago. So machine learning and artificial intelligence capabilities were very limited at the time. It's really been the improved computing capabilities of the past couple of decades that make the artificial intelligence work possible. Well, we had a number of engagements working with AT&T. They were trying to understand how they could transform their offering set at the time. Remember, if you remember your history, we used to have landline phones and phones with long cords on them. The states, each individual state required that the telephone companies provide the service, even if they had to provide service to folks who didn't use it very much. So it was not necessarily a good business to be in, and it was kind of the beginnings of the shall I say, the internet era, well before the iPhone was even created. So the strategic challenges that many of the communications firms faced is how to move out of the regulated space and the long-standing requirements that they had as a regulated firm, and move into a space that was meeting the needs that customers increasingly are having in the early stages of the internet era. You know, that's all that work is long gone and long past now. You know, we're focused on many, many different challenges.
I know AI and the phrase future of work are all such big phrases. And, you know, in this recent report that you wrote, Cognitive Enterprise, you also encourage businesses to rip up the playbook and make changes within their organization to accommodate development of AI to fully benefit from these capacities. But would you mind just telling us a little bit more about how exactly AI could help businesses grow? Because it seems to a lot of people, AI's most helpful areas are just in data analytics or marketing. They haven't really done too much. And a lot of people say they even, AI has overpromised and underdeveloped, especially in cases like, not to put IBM on the spot, but a lot of people said IBM's Watson Health didn't do that good of a job in terms of diagnosing patients and such.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, we all, I'm sure, all of the listeners to the podcast today have used artificial intelligence. The simplest artificial intelligence application is when you're typing a text message and your phone predicts the word that you're trying to type. That is a little simple artificial intelligence, it's machine learning application. So anything, any application like that that's attempting to help you and predict the outcome of the action that you're taking is in principle a machine learning or an artificial intelligence application. When you get on Netflix and it makes a recommendation to you as to what video you might like to watch, the Netflix folks have done a great deal of artificial intelligence work to be able to provide that recommendation to you, and hopefully help you to be more satisfied with their service and enjoy whatever video it is you end up selecting. Same thing when you get on Amazon and you want to buy a book and it says, if you like this book, maybe you like this other book, or any other purchases that you make. Those are all artificial intelligence applications based on the data that you have provided to the provider, Netflix or Amazon or anybody else, and they're making a prediction about the outcome. So those are some examples. There are others, but it's all really about helping to make decisions, be able to produce better quality outcomes.
Dr. Fleming, I was hoping to ask, we do hear a lot of fantastic stories about companies reaping the benefits of AI, Google and Amazon, but are there any maybe older standing brick and mortar establishments or sectors that you feel might be a great opportunity for IBM to offer these kinds of services to that might not have taken them recently or in the past?
Yeah, so certainly you're right. There's a lot of hype, and where we may be 4% of the way or 5% of the way down a path that's going to take 20 or 30 years to fully take advantage of the capabilities. And you're also right that a lot of the early applications have been in the technology industry, and you've cited a few of them. A close cousin of the technology industry is the financial services industry. So whether it's consumer and retail banking or whether it's investment banking, these are the places where a lot of AI applications are beginning to emerge, making recommendations to consumers as to what actions they might want to take around better managing expenses, or perhaps recommendations from an investment decision perspective. So we're beginning to see more and more applications in the financial services space. Likewise, in insurance, many of the large property and casualty insurance firms are attempting to help both themselves and consumers with making better decisions. And a smaller area, for example, in pharmaceuticals, a lot of pharmaceutical research being done by data scientists and using the applications of AI to look at the chemical compounds that can come together to produce new drugs. In using the traditional manual or physical efforts in the physical world, it is a time-consuming process, and a number of the potential combinations can be eliminated through the use of artificial intelligence, and help the pharmaceutical firms get to the combination of compounds that can be more successful more rapidly. So those are some of the areas where we've already seen some applications, and the work is continuing, but we're on a long path here, and the notion that artificial intelligence is about to take over the world just really misses the challenge and the difficulty that organizations face being able to deploy these kind of solutions.
And I suppose if we jump too quickly to the somehow dystopian future, we would also miss out on many of the important contributions that artificial intelligence is already doing. But I also hope to quickly pivot to the theme on future of work, because you've written a lot about it, also on how AI disrupts things. But this COVID-19 crisis has kind of caught us off guard, right? Because it has forced many workers to transition to working from home. Would love to just hear a little bit more of your thoughts on how or whether at all COVID-19 has disrupted a lot of the trends that you were previously predicting.
It has. It really has created an enormous opportunity for transformation. We have, as you referenced earlier, the trend of working from home is one example. But really, if you think a bit more broadly, consumers are really looking to make decisions in a fundamentally different fashion. And there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of anxiety about the spread of the virus. One piece of data, one fact to help to bring home the point is in the month of April, which is the most recent data that we have, in the US, 33% of income, of all the income earned, was saved. Now think about that. The savings rate is usually in the order of 6%, 5%, 8%. 1/3, as an average, 1/3 of all income was not spent, it was saved, which means if that's the average, there were folks on the one end of the extreme and saving 50% of their income. And on the other extreme, you know, quite small, of course. So it's, we've already seen the attitudes of consumers shift quite significantly, and it's going to take time for all of that to unwind itself, to come back. And you know, you ask yourself the question among older, that is non-college students, non-undergraduates, are you seeing folks attending large events, sporting events, theaters? I think the answer is no. College students are the exception, still gathering in large crowds, and that's, you know, that's not happening with most of the rest of the world. Young parents and older folks who are concerned about the continuing spread of the virus. So consumer purchasing has been dramatically impacted by all of this. And it's going to take time for that to unwind.
Dr. Fleming, I was hoping maybe you could kind of go into a little bit more detail about maybe some of like deflationary fears you have with this massive increase in spending. I know the Fed has recently mentioned that they're extremely hesitant for some reason to drop it at negative interest rates. Do you have any opinion or insight on that?
Well, so that's two different questions there. In the US, the Federal Reserve has not adopted the approach that the European Central Bank has with negative interest rates. They feel that it doesn't provide any additional incentive for businesses or consumers to borrow and engage in spending, and it only hurts the profitability of the financial institutions. The issue of negative interest rates is one that has received a great deal of attention, and really has been looked at pretty carefully in the U.S. by the Federal Reserve, and it's almost certain that they're going to stay away from negative interest rates. With respect to deflation, deflation is of course a grave concern because as consumers and businesses, we've seen this in Japan quite significantly, as consumers and businesses begin to postpone purchases because they expect prices to be lower in the future. You know, imagine you're going to make a purchase and you think, oh, a month from now, I'll get a better deal. I'll wait till the price drops. As that continues to happen time after time after time, economic activity and growth gets slower and slower and slower and turns negative. So you get into a deflationary spiral, which we've seen, particularly in Japan, is very difficult to get out of. So the notion that we want to avoid deflation is one that's very important, and it's quite a severe issue. So it's going to receive a lot of attention from monetary policymakers.
Negative interest rate is something that Will and I are both very interested in because we did our junior year research paper on related topics, as you may know. So
yeah, I do know. It's a terrific paper. Congratulations.
So I was gonna ask you, since we're on the topic of Fed economic projections and unemployment, recently the Fed said that the unemployment rate will end at 9.3% at the end of 2020, which is a huge number. I mean, we're not seeing this level of unemployment for a very, very long time. Right. And you released your report on the future of work in 2019, which was a time that Fed Chair Jerome Powell said when the US had its first tight labor market in years. So we transitioned from a very tight labor market to right now with huge high inflations. And I would just love to get a little bit more of your thoughts on how you project the next couple of years shape up for labor market, as also whether that changes some of your predictions.
So we expect that we're going to continue to see both the U.S. economy and the global economy struggle over the next couple of years. We have to first begin by having a point of view around public health conditions. And I'm going to separate two thoughts between public health versus healthcare. When you think about healthcare, that's care delivered in a physician's office or a clinic or a hospital, which of course matters in this case because the capacity of the system to deliver care is the constraint that policymakers face in the presence of the COVID-19 disease. Public health is around epidemiology and virology and understanding the virus and the spread of the virus and where that might be headed into the future. Our view is that it's going to take time to develop, for the global population to develop sufficient immunity for the virus to no longer be a threat. The virus is not going to go away. It's just like measles and chickenpox. Measles and chickenpox still exist, but we're all largely immune to it, so it's not a problem. The SARS-CoV-2 virus will very likely, with some high probability, always exist in the world, but at some point over the next, hopefully, 3 or 4 years, there'll be sufficient immunity, probably as a result of a vaccine, that it will no longer impact our lives on a daily basis. So the question is, how are we going to get to that immunity and how long is it going to take? It's probably not going to be herd immunity. In other words, we're all infecting each other, perhaps except among college students. But for the rest of the world, we're probably going to have a vaccine. The vaccine will probably have to be distributed worldwide, and billions of people will have to be vaccinated in order to build up that immunity. That's going to take time. It's not going to happen quickly. Even if we have a vaccine developed in 12 to 18 months, that would be a record pace for that to occur. And then, of course, we need to have the vaccine manufactured in large quantities, and then, of course, has to be distributed and deployed through the healthcare system to people. All of that impacts the economic. The reason why I take you through all of that is all of that impacts the economic outlook. This week, for example, we got a forecast that was published by OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, headquartered in Paris, which is expecting with some high probability a return to a recession in the second half of 2020 and early 2021, when a second wave of infections begins to appear. So as these waves of infection appear, it's going to impact economic activity to some extent because there'll have to be a return to social distancing and quarantines to some extent. That's why you see the labor market forecast and the unemployment rate forecasts, which are continuing to be quite high. Consumers are fearful, they're returning to activity slowly, therefore workers are being returned to work slowly, and both in terms of demand, labor demand is slow, but also on the supply side, many workers are fearful to return to work as well. So it impacts both sides of the labor market, both supply and demand, and consequently elevating the unemployment rate. But all of it follows from whatever you believe is going to occur from a public health perspective.
Well, under this greater backdrop of COVID-19 crisis, and as you mentioned, the difficulties on both the supply and demand of labor market, and as I was reading through some of your reports on the future of work, one thought I had was that in the intersection of the debate between automation and labor market, I just think if automation is fairly easily accessible for employers, and if it's harder to bring employees back to work, And if the government chooses to, raise the minimum wage or raise corporate tax, whatever, for some reason, then the employers may simply just choose to automate away the jobs and not bring the workers back. And Will and I studied labor economics a little bit this past spring as well. So it's something that we would love to hear your thoughts on.
So automation doesn't happen like that. That's not how it works. When businesses automate a business process, number one, you need the talent. You need the data scientists. You need the developers. You need the, we think of them as consultants, but the folks with business acumen and strategy skill, so that they can understand the business process. And then number two, the business process has to be transformed. You're not going to automate. If the process is not working and you think you'd like to introduce some automation, you don't automate a broken process. You transform the business process, and in the process of transformation, you introduce the automation. And then number three, you have to change the behavior of individuals. So it's becomes a change management challenge, because nobody likes to have to change the way they do things. Nobody likes change, so change management is difficult. All of that, the talent, the business process transformation, the change management, all has to happen after the technology has been put in place. The technology shift is difficult. I would assert it's not the most difficult piece of it, but it is still difficult nonetheless. But think about organizations that have dozens of, even a large organization like IBM thinks of itself as having dozens of business processes, all needing to be transformed. It doesn't happen quickly. It takes time to do all of this change that's occurring. So you just can't magically, what's the right word? Snap your fingers or wish it to occur. It's real work.
And on the context of time, Dr. Fleming, I was wondering, do you have any idea at this point of a before and after picture, maybe caused by the coronavirus crisis, where businesses seem to be accelerating their interest to have almost a complete kind of work from home environment? And maybe a question to add on to that is, are there any aspects of working in a corporate office, having some kind of face-to-face interaction you feel will still be important to maintain in the future?
Yeah, so our view has always been that getting folks to work together, sit in the same room, sit in a long table together, be able to interact on a daily or a weekly basis, just as you and Tiger did when you were doing your monetary policy paper. That's a very productive environment and way to work, because you don't have to send text messages to each other, or we use Slack, of course. Many organizations use Slack, or email back and forth, or have conference calls or video conferences. Everybody's all working together. Now that's not possible, of course, when a pandemic is on. But nonetheless, there still continue to be benefits to having teams work together in a productive environment. So we're going to have to learn differently. How can we make use of the video conferencing capability that we all have, so that we can all work together on a video conference, maybe all day long, 8 hours a day on a video conference, working together, to be creative and to be innovative and to be able to work and build off others' ideas. But then there will be other circumstances where folks need to come together, keeping the appropriate 6-foot difference, but still sitting around the same area where they can interact and engage in creative work and innovation together. So the world is relearning the difference between those two different modes of operation, and it's going to take time.
And I suppose, after COVID-19 happened, Morgan Stanley's CEO, James Gorman, came out and said, I don't really foresee thousands of Morgan Stanley employees crowding back to the skyscrapers, and a lot of Silicon Valley startups, like the small startups like Zoom or Slack, they said they're very comfortable commanding their employees remotely. But I suppose for a very traditional tech giant like IBM or Oracle, I mean, it's very hard to just completely transition to remote work.
I wouldn't agree with that. 95% of IBM employees today are working from home. And it will likely stay that way for much of the rest of the year. As far as I know, decisions have yet to be made around when a return to work or return to the office environment will occur. It's it's still work from home, I think, for many, if not all, technology organizations.
I had a quick question. There's been a lot of discussion and controversy over sometimes the efficiency of AI and how much data is actually being generated day to day. Do you think a transition to something like what we're doing right now on Zoom that can almost capture everything we're saying, maybe any element of our interaction, might actually improve what solutions could be achieved through AI, rather than potentially having conversations in the office that might never actually be somehow recorded or used in the future?
Well, certainly more data is always helpful. Being able to take video or audio and turn it into data, what we would call natural language processing, is an important area of work and of effort, and a lot of progress is being made. But all of that requires an enormous amount of effort to be able to deploy those capabilities, and it's being done. But again, there is enormous amount of unstructured data in the world, and we're only beginning to tackle that challenge.
And I think Tiger and I just have to ask, as college students, where do you think learning more about data science and AI would begin? Has IBM focused on changes in college education? I mean, both of us, we know that this kind of degree might not actually be offered at many universities yet, right, or might it even start at a high school level? Because it's certainly something that doesn't seem.
Well, there are certainly high school students that are learning how to code in Python. So that's a great first step. We're seeing more and more of that. We have, one of my roles at IBM is to lead the data science profession. One element of the data science profession is a certification that we've created with an outside third-party group, so that those who get certified within IBM will have that recognition externally as well. We're now working with two universities, I guess. We're in the early stages of working with two universities to begin to introduce that certification capability into their academic programs, so that students who are studying data science can, number one, earn a certification, but number two, learn what the requirements are in terms of working and the recruitment and the hiring process. So we're beginning to see more and more of that activity at the undergraduate level.
I think it's really interesting because you talked about the rise of data science, and a lot of people are also talking about the rise of data scientists. It's really interesting because I just interviewed the chief data officer at NFL just last week, and he said he thinks in the future there will be more chief data officers who take on CEO roles. I mean, we're already kind of seeing this because Satya Nadella at Microsoft, Sundar Pichai at Alphabet, Google, Arvind Krishna recently took over at IBM, and those are all Indian-born executives who were trained as engineers and rose through the ranks in very technical positions, and their background are very different from the stereotypical corporate America managers who came in from sales and general management after receiving MBA degrees. So I would love just to hear a little bit more of your thoughts. Do you think in a corporation like IBM, as it pivots to the future, it would just need more data scientists who also understand businesses?
Absolutely. The combination of data science and what we refer to as business acumen, to be able to understand how businesses function, operate, challenges, problems, that combination is really what we're looking for in data science. Now, there is no Renaissance person who has all a package of skills. So you have to team people together. But over time, we hope to develop those skills so that those folks who bring the data science skills can learn the business skills, and those folks who come with the business skills can learn the data science skills. But you're right, it's the combination of the two that really is what all organizations are looking for. But it has to be grown and developed over time. We all have our strengths and we all have our limitations. And through experience, you can help to even those things out.
So Dr. Fleming, I think Will and I were just thinking right before the interview, there must be a separation between COVID-19's impact on the future of work versus the longer term of future of work in general that might contain machine learning or AI or other technologies that you and your colleagues have long studied about before the coronavirus even hit. So I thought maybe Will and I had already asked you a bunch of questions on how COVID-19 changed, work from home and stuff like that. But maybe we could dive in a little bit deeper about your research on, the long-term future of work. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that?
Well, economic shocks have not surprisingly a significant impact on global economic activity. We all know, perhaps I shouldn't say we all know. I'm sure many of your listeners will have learned about the great financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and realize that in the subsequent 10 years since that time, the global economy, and in particular in the US, but the other developed economies, have really been quite disappointing in terms of growth, productivity growth, wealth accumulation, and importantly, increased income inequality. It turns out that economic shocks of the magnitude of the great financial crisis quite often have these persistent effects where disappointing or subpar growth conditions exist for an extended period. We can look, for example, way back in history in the 1970s when there were two very large oil price shocks, both of which were followed by recessions, and then both of which subsequently were followed by very weak economic growth. Certainly, you'll be familiar with the China shock, right? David Artur at MIT has done a lot of work with his colleagues around the impact that the entrance of China into the global economy and its role as the world's factory has had on many parts of the United States, as well as Europe and Japan, but in particular the United States. And not only have we seen job losses, but we've seen quite dire social consequences with opioid addiction, increased incarceration rates, suicides, divorces, etc. So an economic shock that has had quite deep and profound social consequences. However, not all economic shocks result in such pessimistic or poor outcomes. If you think about what happened during the Second World War in the United States, manufacturing industry converted on a massive scale to wartime production. The auto industry was producing military vehicles. There were clothing manufacturers who were producing uniforms and clothing and equipment. Even an organization like IBM converted production to produce weapons that were needed by the military. So enormous disruption to economic activity. And of course, there was a large military that was built. Many young men, they were largely young men, although there were some young women, joined the military, learned new skills, learned new behaviors, new ways of living, became much more disciplined in their lifestyles. And of course, women who weren't in the military, many went out to work because the men who left had to be replaced by the women who stayed home. All of this, of course, came to an end. And with all the skill that was built up through the experience in the military, through the experience in the workforce, and the benefit of the GI Bill, which financed college tuition for veterans in the military, there was an enormous increase in the education level of the workforce. And the experience, the transformation of the manufacturing sector and all the skill that was built up resulted in, or was followed by, a period of very strong economic growth. And the key is that when economic activity gets disrupted, businesses don't go back to doing things the old way. They find new ways to do things and put in new technology and new manufacturing facilities and new business processes combined with the new skills that workers learned through the military and through their experience. And that contributed to a 30-year period of very, very strong growth. Of course, as you'll know from your history, there was also the US-Soviet Cold War, an enormous investment in the space program, an enormous investment in the military, all of which created considerable intellectual property, intellectual capital, which also added to growth. One quick example that I find quite interesting is one of the reasons why cell phones, iPhones, mobile phones work so well today is because of data compression. You know, transmitting all of the data all at once in every call. But there were enormous advances in data compression in the space program in the 60s and the 70s because data is being transmitted over such vast distances in outer space that data compression became very important. And that now has led to enormous innovation that we're still continuing to realize all of these years later. So that's an example of a shock, quite shocking shock, a military world war shock that then led to enormous growth. We can debate and we can argue the causality, but it's quite an interesting coincidence as to how all this happened with industry transforming from the old way to the new way, new skill being developed, new technology, new intellectual property being developed. So my question is the pandemic a shock of equal magnitude? And if we're going to go through this for 3 or 4 years and we're going to disrupt our lives and be forced to find new ways to do things, is that going to result in some very positive outcomes in terms of growth, productivity, income growth, wealth, and perhaps even more or less unequal distribution of income? And so those are some of the questions that we've begun to think about.
Yeah, Dr. Fleming, if I may, one quick question as we kind of expand to a more global perspective. Maybe you could tell people who might be listening about IBM's scope in that regard. Are there any economies beyond the United States you might be focusing on or you might be interested in the most in offering some of these products? I know you coin yourselves as the international business machines, of course, but I'm not sure if people listening might know exactly where you could be.
Sure. So absolutely. IBM operates in about 200 countries around the world. IBM's revenue looks a bit like global GDP and in terms of the proportions and the percentages of how it's distributed, roughly in proportion to economic activity globally. And of course, China and Japan are very important markets for IBM. And all of the growth and innovation that's occurring in those markets are places where our teams are doing quite important work. And likewise in Europe, which is of course now coming together in a more single market, more unified fashion. And of course, Africa and Latin America, which are certainly Africa is growing very rapidly, seeing a very rapid growth. And certainly beginning to transform and adopt many of the technologies that we're talking about here.
And just touching again on what you were mentioning earlier about the magnitude of the COVID crisis, have any other economists mentioned any opinions that maybe are contradictory to yours on what they think about this crisis versus something like the Great Recession or the dot-com bubble, something like that?
Yeah, I haven't heard any yet, but I think it's only because it's too soon. We'll have as many opinions as we have economists on this topic, I'm sure, before too long. But but certainly when we talk with C-level executives who are leading large organizations, they're really focused on they have two real priorities. One, the first priority in all these discussions really is the health and safety of their workers and their workers' families, their ability to continue to work and take time off and pay attention to the needs of their family, but also be able to stay healthy and stay safe. It's really, for all the criticism that business leaders and the business sector gets, and a lot of accused of a lot of nasty behavior, it's really been quite heartening to see the real genuine concern that business leaders have over the health and safety of their workforces. And then secondly is the notion of this longer term transformation. I would say most leaders don't have a firm or clear view as to where that transformation is headed or what it might look like, but intuitively they believe that the kind of disruption that we're experiencing is going to result in significant change over a period of a few years. So it's still a bit nascent, still new, but nonetheless, there's a recognition that we're in for probably some fairly significant change.
Dr. Fleming, one question I wanted to ask, like a popular example of how quickly things change, especially within the technological sector that gets pulled up a lot, is like Moore's law, where maybe the computing power or the number of transistors you can add to one of the silicon chips doubles every 2 years. Do you feel like maybe your opinions or your outlooks on the future of work also change every, I don't know, 1 to 2 years? Is that something you feel happens often?
Well, that's an interesting question. I was talking with a group of colleagues recently, and we're talking about not Moore's law, where we see capabilities doubling every 18 months, but a law that's yet to be named around artificial intelligence, where capabilities are doubling every 3 months. So there's a real recognition that the kinds of innovation in growth that's necessary to be able to deliver the kind of value that we all want in both our personal and our business lives is happening at a pretty fast pace.
And can you speak?
I don't know, sorry to interrupt, Will, but I don't know whether or not anybody's proven the 3 months yet, but that's the hypothesis that we're seeing very, very rapid change.
Yeah, no problem at all. I was wondering if you could maybe speak a little bit about the long-term effects of AI on maybe the lower income workers. I know you mentioned that there are a lot of emerging economies that might have this type of labor. I'm just wondering if you could talk about maybe your outlook for 20 years on specifically low-income workers, and not necessarily the United States as well. Perhaps
yeah. So that's an interesting question, because the technology could possibly have a differential impact across different regions of the world. Whereas in the United States and to some degree Western Europe and Japan, the impact has been more in the mid-wage workers, the middle tier, if you will, of workers. We use the term job polarization, where the low wage and the high wage workers is where more employment is appearing, and it's the mid-wage workers that have lost employment share. But in the developing and emerging market world, where low-cost labor has been important, many of these low-cost roles are ones that perhaps are more easily automated. You think about call center work that we see quite a bit of in a country like India, as more and more natural language processing capability, both for voice and for text, becomes available. There's likely to be less demand for call center workers across many of these countries. And for other similar, more manual, repetitive functions, if you will. So the impact could be quite different across the differing geographies. In the US and Western Europe, it will likely be more of an issue around the distribution of income and wages, particularly for mid-income workers, whereas in the developing and emerging market economies, it may be more of an issue of the share of employment for low-wage workers.
I think it would also be important to bring up the caveat that you actually brought up earlier in our interview, is that automation doesn't happen overnight or in a couple of months.
Right.
We're talking about longer term trends.
We were talking about change that's going to happen over time. And so that gives workers an opportunity to improve their skills, transform their skills, find new opportunities to work in new areas. And that's important for workers to understand, that we're seeing the rate and pace of change increase, and it's necessary to continuously upgrade our skills.
You were just previously mentioning about how shocks led to this enormous transformation of technology, and even the world wars or the Cold War has led to this eruption of intellectual power.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much intellectual capacity being built. And IBM research and people like you, the researchers who produce knowledge, are very much at the forefront pushing this wave of innovation. And as I mentioned very early in the beginning, IBM research is kind of the forefront model that also inspired Microsoft, Amazon, Google to then develop their own research department. So I would love to hear a little bit more about your thoughts on how IBM research or even Microsoft research, or any of those big corporations are using research to take us to the next step. Do you think private corporations' research departments can have a better understanding of topics like AI than government agencies who push for or universities who work on AI research? Would love to just hear a little bit more.
Yeah, so certainly it's true that research organizations in the private sector are working much more closely with the really detailed and large business problems that need to be solved. So they have an advantage of being able to do the research that's necessary, directed to the practical implementation and opportunities to create value. Now, in the case of IBM, for example, we have created quite a unique partnership with MIT, where instead of IBM providing a very large financial contribution to MIT, both MIT and IBM together have formed a partnership, each contributing $250 million over 10 years to jointly research artificial intelligence and related topics around causal inference. So this is a way of being able to bring the academic community and the research community together to address and attack problems in a very practical way. I would also suggest that partnering with governments is also important as part of this. We have a great deal of partnerships with both the U.S. government as well, quite importantly with the European Union as well, and so that leg of the partnership is a critical element as well.
And in terms of research and maybe even partnership, like you're saying, one topic we were hoping to touch on while we have you is our digital currencies. Mm-hmm. Something Tiger and I are certainly both interested in. I've taken that course with Professor Brunemeyer, who's definitely an expert on the topic. And we're wondering if you could just speak a little bit about your own research and IBM's involvement with promoting some kind of blockchain cryptocurrency, and how maybe it might compare to what other countries in Europe and China have already tried to implement.
Sure. So the first distinction that I always try to make is the difference between a cryptocurrency, as we might know, a Bitcoin or other related cryptocurrencies, and a digital currency, where cryptocurrencies typically are used as a way of compensating oftentimes developers who are contributing code in development projects. I think of those currencies as much more like a security which one accumulates and grows in value and accumulates wealth as a result. A digital currency is much more like cash or for transactional purposes, to be able to make transactions more efficient. The challenge is that when we want to make payments, particularly in the business sector, it's a very inefficient process today. So here's an example. Imagine that we have a very large ship filled with automobiles that leaves Japan and arrives at Long Beach Harbor. Maybe 10,000 automobiles, and there may be $5 million worth of payments that have to be made by the receivers of those automobiles, the dealers who are receiving them, back to the manufacturer in Japan. Well, it's going to take 3 or 4 days for that payment to occur. That's in effect a 1% tax, reducing the value of that payment to the manufacturer. So it's a very inefficient process because every transaction takes 3 or 4 days to be completed. A digital currency, on the other hand, is much more immediate. I can send the both of you an email and you'll get it in a few seconds. But if I want to send you $10,000, it's going to take 4 days. So there really is no real reason for that delay, other than the fact that there's a large number of incumbent bankers who generate a lot of revenue and a lot of income as a result of the payment system, right? Because all this cash is sitting on various balance sheets overnight at various places. And so naturally there's a reluctance to transform that business. So somebody's going to come along and figure out how to do this more efficiently and be able to competitively threaten the existing established players. Now, we do have banks like JP Morgan Chase, who of course recognize this and have really been quite active in creating their own version of a digital currency. So that's certainly smart strategic initiative, a smart strategic initiative. But nonetheless, there's certainly a great deal of reluctance to address that source of inefficiency. But along comes a number of smaller countries. One not so small country, which is China, is now launching a digital currency. But there are other smaller central banks taking similar actions. The challenge is, of course, a very large proportion of the world's transactions occur in dollars. If a digital currency is going to be really successful, it has to be a Federal Reserve digital currency because of the volume of transactions that occur. Now, because the dollar is the world's global currency, there are enormous advantages to those of us who live in the US. Our interest rates are lower, meaning we can buy homes and cars and all kinds of other products, including the business sector can borrow funds at lower rates. There is what has been referred to as an exorbitant advantage of having the dollar as the global digital currency. So there's a bit of a war here, right, between maintaining the advantage that the US has with the global currency and other players, other nations, trying to take advantage of the inefficiencies that exist shall we say, supplant the dollar. And this is going to play out over an extended period of time. I'm not sure anybody knows exactly yet where it's all going to take us, but it's an important debate.
And I was hoping, could you talk a little bit more about how the Federal Reserve might take control or manage a cryptocurrency? Because I think for a lot of people listening, they know about Bitcoin, but that certainly has a decentralized nature, right, that's not necessarily controlled by the government at all. And it also has even had kind of an interesting taxation scheme where it's treated more like an investment with capital gains.
Right.
I know that's probably not what the federal government has in mind if they were to introduce a new cryptocurrency. So
Yeah. So there's been there are interesting proposals. In fact, there's one, for anybody who's really interested in this topic, Julia Coronado and Simon Potter at the Peterson Institute have a paper outlining exactly the kind of proposal you're asking about. So you can imagine the Federal Reserve creating a digital currency, and it would then put on its balance sheet a third liability. So they have reserves and cash today. They would add a digital currency as another liability they would issue, and then they can make that available in various ways, either to banks or dealers or even consumers. Now that's the most probably far-fetched and far-out idea. It would require significant legislative change, but you can imagine that at some future point in time, it would be quite a radical change. But the Federal Reserve could make a digital currency available to households as well, and it would of course add that liability to its balance sheet, and it would look like an electronic version of cash.
And just to go off of that, can you clarify, when you talk about adding this as maybe a third element to a balance sheet, does that mean a cryptocurrency used by the federal government might have some kind of centralized ledger system, or is this still something decentralized? Because I know that is also a characteristic. Right.
Yeah, so for a central bank digital currency, it would be centralized. It would sit on the central bank's balance sheet, whether it's here in the US at the Federal Reserve or any of the other countries who are already doing this. That's another one of the differences between a digital currency and a cryptocurrency, which of course is decentralized.
And one thing maybe we were hoping to know about IBM's involvement with something like this is, do you see any serious technological vulnerabilities with something like a cryptocurrency that we might not have seen with just minted money? Is there anything that maybe IBM could get involved with when currency might become even more technological?
Yeah, well, so there are, of course, there are enormous issues. There are security issues with physical currency as well. If you look at where US $100 bills are circulating, a very small proportion are circulating in the US. Most of it is used by other somewhat nefarious creatures around the world for various transactions. So there are certainly security issues on both sides of this. And like any electronic transaction, there's always going to be the need to pay attention to cyber risk. But with respect to the larger question of the involvement of an organization like IBM, you can imagine that if the payment system today that is being operated by the financial sector and the large financial institutions switches over to a real-time payment system with a digital currency, a vast proportion of their IT infrastructure would have to be fundamentally redesigned and changed. So that would, now, of course, for an organization like IBM, that would be a tremendous opportunity. But on the other hand, it would be a quite significant change that the banking system would have to go through in order to be able to accommodate real-time payments, because they're not set up to do that today. The rails that all of these transactions ride on are really based on this 2-3 day payment process.
And I know we just quickly touched on some other economies around the world that might be implementing something like this. Do you feel like the US or IBM has their eyes on any country in particular that might be piloting cryptocurrency right now? Just off the top of my head, I'm
thinking. So the Monetary Authority of Singapore is probably the central bank that's been the most active in this space. Now, China, of course, has announced a digital currency and has begun to launch a currency. So they're very active as well, in a much more limited fashion in terms of its use and its circulation. But certainly, the Monetary Authority of Singapore is quite ambitious in this space. There are other nations that are beginning to look at this work. Other South Asian nations and Middle East nations. So there are a number of smaller central banks that are building capabilities in this area.
Dr. Fleming, one thing.
Earlier, somebody's going to figure this out at some point, and it will change the way we do things.
Dr. Fleming, one thing I am quite curious about after hearing, especially the distinction you made between cryptocurrency and digital currency, it's a really interesting distinction. And one thing that came up to my mind is Facebook's whole spiel about Libra.
Yeah.
And Zuckerberg even went to the Capitol Hill and testified, and there was so much opposition, not just from US lawmakers, but also even from European lawmakers and Bank of International Settlements against that. And it just seemed to people that we don't want Facebook to have, our money. We don't want Facebook to be able to print money. Right. And that's the sense. So I suppose that's where the clear distinction comes in, is that in our future, a digital currency that is helped also managed by the government, that helps with transaction and payment, will probably make our life easier, whereas something that is controlled by a corporation is probably not as safe, that probably won't make people feel safe enough to give money to.
Yeah, so Facebook, of course, faces their own challenges. Some of us are old enough to go back to a time in 2004 when we clicked on the I agree button on Facebook and didn't really know what we were agreeing to. Facebook probably didn't know what we were agreeing to, where they were asking us to agree to either, and subsequently have used all of our private information in many different ways, some good and perhaps some quite not so good. So it's a bit of a reputational issue that members of Congress have with Facebook. And also central bankers who are quite explicit in saying we didn't understand the privacy implications when we were joining the Facebook global network. We're certainly not going to repeat that if and when Facebook begins to be part of a group launching a digital currency. So the regulators are taking a very active role because of the use of private information in the past, and not going to be fooled again.
Absolutely. I think the rise of quote unquote cryptocurrency was also coupled with people's distrust for the financial system or the Wall Street. So it kind of had this mystical image, but then as you rightly explained, the sense of digital currency where it helps us with our payments and able to be backed by central banks and governments, that's also kind of a different story from the Bitcoin that we know. So absolutely. Do you have a timeline for us, prediction in terms of when we might have that total transformation?
Yeah, it's really difficult to know. Certainly the Chinese are going to push hard over the course of the next couple of years. The U.S., the Federal Reserve, has announced a plan to have a real-time payment system of sorts, which is a good first step. The Bank of England has a real-time payment system that they're implementing. That's not a digital currency; it's just a real-time payments system. So it's going to depend upon where the pressure comes from and who's willing to respond. But I don't believe it's going to happen quickly. One way to think about this is, the British pound was the global currency for a very long period of time. And early in the 20th century, the dollar became the world's global currency, where global transactions are conducted in dollars. We're now talking something that's been 100 years. So these cycles last a long time. Now we're talking about technology and a digital currency, so the cycles are probably not nearly as long, but nonetheless, we're probably the unit of measure is probably centuries, whether it's a quarter of a century or a half a century or a full century. It's not years. So these things happen over a long period of time.
Uh, Dr. Fleming, before we end the interview, I know we've already taken so much of your time. Is there anything else in this role that is going on that's on your mind, that's in IBM's mind that you think we haven't touched on? Anything interesting that you think might be good for our listeners to know?
Well, I think the the topic of interest for me really at the moment is the topic that we've spent time on is what is it that will follow the pandemic? How long will it take I mean, the virus is not going to go away. Viruses don't go away. They, for the most part, I mean, that's probably not a completely true statement, but for the most part, viruses don't disappear. We as humans develop immunity to them. And so the question is, how long is it going to take to develop enough immunity that we can return to a life where we don't have to be concerned with whether we're 2 meters or 6 feet apart or wearing masks or social distancing. And that day will come, but it's going to take time. And when that day arrives, what will the world begin to look like? What will the transformation begin to be? Will it be more of the same, or will we see some fundamental differences? Certainly from a leadership and more of a political point of view, we're entering into a period, obviously, with a presidential election here in the US, and it's very likely that whoever wins the presidential election will be managing our way or leading the way through the process for most of the next 4 years, perhaps leading the nation and perhaps the world through some significant change and transformation. So it's going to be a real challenge, whoever ends up being the winner in this contest here in the next 5 months.
And Dr. Fleming, sorry we didn't mention this earlier, but we were hoping to just hear maybe a little bit about the cool background you have going on there.
So there are a few faculty members from Berkeley, led by Olaf Groff, who have a firm called Cambrian Futures, and they organized a webcast that ended up having about 400 attendees earlier last week on many of the same topics that we're talking about here, and really the intersection of technology, economics, and leadership in the coronavirus era, and what that's likely to lead to in terms of the outcome of the dislocation that we're all going through today.
I'm sad to not see Policy Punchline's logo on your virtual background. We should also next time try to sponsor the conference.
Right. All you have to do is send me a chart, and I'll put it onto Zoom.
Of course, Dr. Fleming. Last question before you go. Since the name of our show is Policy Punchline, we always ask our guests at the very end, what's your punchline here for the show?
My punchline is that we're very likely to see very, very dramatic policy change and transformation over the course of the next several years. It's more in the US, it's more likely to occur under a Biden administration. Perhaps less likely to occur under a second Trump administration. But I suspect, and that's part of what we're seeing in the streets today, right? There's riots, there's protests, there's a reaction to the racism and the bigotry that we see. But I think a lot of the reaction that we see in the streets is reflective of much greater pressure in terms of not only the pandemic, but the disappointing economic performance in general. It's, from Les Miserables, there's the famous song, "Do you hear the people sing?" Well, the people are singing in the streets. And there's now enormous pressure for change, and that's where the policy punchline comes. What are the changes that we're going to see in policy as a result of all of this pressure that's built up? Not just, quite importantly, in the racial sphere, but also for workers and from a labor market perspective, campaign finance, the role of money in government. So I think we're going to see some quite significant change. There probably will not be any presidential candidates promising the voters of America radical change, because that's probably not a good way to get elected president. But ultimately, I think that's what's likely to emerge, and it's in part a reflection of what we're seeing in the streets today.
Well, thank you so much for that insightful and optimistic punchline at the end, Dr. Fleming. And thank you for all the work that you and IBM and your peer corporations are doing, carrying us forward through waves of innovations ahead. So thank you so much for joining Will and I today.
Yeah, good talking with you guys.
And Will, thanks so much for co-hosting the show with me, Will. Really appreciate you getting me prepared on all those questions from digital currency to future work. Thanks so much.
Great. Yeah. Okay, guys.
And this concludes this episode of Policy Punchline. Please visit us on policypunchline.com. Find us on iTunes, Spotify, rate and review us. That was our interview with Dr. Martin Fleming. He's the IBM's chief economist. A wonderful conversation. You may watch the video on our YouTube channel as well. Thank you so much for listening today.
You've been listening to Policy Punchline, a podcast generously supported by the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University. We would also like to encourage you to follow other podcasts produced by Princeton University, such as Politics and Polls by the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Policy Punchline is intended to be informational only and does not reflect nor represent the views of Princeton University or the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. For more information on subscription, donation, volunteering, or contact, please visit policypunchline.com. Thank you again for listening.